Well, g'day everyone. Welcome again to our second podcast for Canterbury Gardens Community Church. We're a church in the outer east of Melbourne. My name is Shebu. We desire to be a church that loves Jesus, wants to live for Jesus in this world, and we as a church have been going through the Ten Commandments, and this podcast is mainly for our church family, our church community. But if you're listening in, welcome. I don't know, the other day I was looking at the stats, Mark, and I found out there were some people like in Latvia listening, which is probably someone we know, but
Really, yeah.
I felt like we've made it. We've kind of become global, Mark.
Global. We'll take it.
So we've been going through the Ten Commandments as a church, and during our series with some of them, we've been asking people to send in questions. And today I've got the privilege to talk about it again with Mark. G'day, Mark. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here, and it's an important topic.
Yeah, it is. And it's an interesting topic. So what we're going to be talking about is from Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. I'll read the verse to us, and then we'll jump into some of the questions that came through. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, here is God's word. It says, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." So it may seem a little bit archaic, particularly in the culture that we live in, and particularly in Melbourne, in Victoria, in Australia. It sounds interesting depending on what background you've had. So one of the first questions that was on there was, why is this even relevant today? Any thoughts on that, Mark, to start off with? You're looking at my notes, I can tell. So do you want me to just go first? Is that
You go. Yeah, you tell us.
So why is it relevant today? Well, it depends on how you come across this. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, at the end of the day, it's not really on you to actually do this. But if you are a follower of Jesus, it is a command in God's word, the Bible. And so it is relevant for us today. It's not something that's just stays in the Old Testament, because both Jesus talks about it and the Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks about it, so which means it's relevant for us today. And I think my reflection has been that it is God's design. It was created by God. So in the garden, he created man and woman, Adam and Eve, to be in loving relationship under his loving authority. He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. And part of that is not them also enjoying intimacy with each other, but actually the call to be parents, to care and love those that God puts under their loving authority. And so it is connected with that. So I think it goes all the way back to the garden, and it is God's design. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why it's relevant. Would you add anything to that, or comments, or even pushbacks? I shouldn't assume that you should agree with me.
Yeah, I think that is a key part of it. And I think there is a question about that promise at the end, that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. But I do think that's hinting towards this is a healthy way for society to be.
Yep.
And as you pointed out, it's because that's the way the world was designed to be.
Yep.
So even when you describe Adam and Eve being good parents to their children, the other thing I keep in mind is that God is being the ultimate parent to Adam and Eve. So even that's the way Luke describes the genealogy, the son of Adam, the son of God. Adam is the son of God, and God is a father to him.
Yeah. And the interesting language in the Old Testament anyway, in regards to the word honor, it's not just a word, it's an action word. It's a verb that it speaks of. And so you have to do it. It's an imperative that it calls people. One of the definitions I read was it calls for people to give their parents the respect and honor that's appropriate for them. It could be paraphrased to say, give them the weight of authority that they deserve next to God. Parents were to be highly valued, cared for, and respected. And in some of the passages in the Bible, the word is very similar to also when they put the weight on money. So the sense of the weight it has, the weightiness, and that's why the word honor is pretty distinctive in the way that God describes it.
Yeah. Why is this relevant today? We might say, why is it relevant to encourage people to honor? And I think we naturally think about the idea of parenting as caring and loving and emotional attachment towards. But you keep talking about this this idea of reverence for their position and their authority. And I think that's something that we can tend to maybe under focus on. So we think about, obviously, a father gives life and a mother together give life to their child, which is important. Adam and Eve are put there to be fruitful and multiply and care for that generation beneath them. But they're also there at the same time made to rule the earth. And so if they're guardians and rulers of God's world, then that role of authority has been given to them by God. So it's an integral part of being a parent.
Yeah, that's helpful. You mentioned, or you alluded to it, and one of the questions that came in was, what are your thoughts on live long in the land the Lord has given you?
Yeah. So that is part of the original commandment. And it's a wonderful command because it's said in the most positive and glowing terms. Yeah. We lead on to all these, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. But this is just a wonderfully wholesome, full, honour your parents. And the reason is because it will be good for your life in the land the Lord your God has given you. So in the first place, in the Ten Commandments, that's talking about the promised land, that I'm bringing you out of Egypt, out of a land of slavery and hardship. I'm pretty sure you talked about this in your message if people go back to it, out of that time of hardship into the land, and you're supposed to flourish there. We've been saying that all the way through.
Yep.
And here's how it will flourish if relationships are set up right. And the ultimate purpose of that relationship is that the parents who have learned how to live in God's world, God's way, pass that on to the children and on to the children's children.
Yep.
So Deuteronomy 6 verse 2 says, these commands are for you and for your son and for your grandson, or for you and for your daughter and for your granddaughter. If you pass on this way of living and thriving, this is good. So whether God rewards an individual with long life or a society with success and health, it's significant enough that Paul reminds people in Ephesians 6 of that promise, isn't it? And then always go back to the Garden of Eden. If only Adam and Eve had have not chosen to rule themselves and honoured their parents, wouldn't they have flourished in the Garden of Eden?
That's right. And I think that's the thing that struck me is this is, I think it's in the New Testament and Paul talks about in Ephesians, which you'll get to, but it's the one with the promise is the language that he uses. And there might be different views on this, but in relation to the context, at least, for the people that are listening to this, the thing that always strikes me, as you mentioned, even when Moses mentions this again, goes through the law again, there's this constant refrain of teach this to your children, who will teach it to their children. And this generational aspect of it, I think, has really been probably something I haven't seen as much because I was grown up so much here in Australia that it's very individualistic. Like even reading this verse, I can go, oh, that's ultimately about me.
Yep.
Where this is actually one of the first moments where it's not just a individual thing. It actually impacts, like we've been going through the commandments, the whole people around you, whole culture around you. And as people live this out, there's a promise that this is good for you. It'll go well for you and your culture and for your people if you continue this vision of honoring.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's a good point in case we forget, is to remind us all that whether we're parents, well, we're all children, but whether we're parents or not, this is a good way to feed into society if we're encouraging the children in our lives, our nieces and our nephews, or Sunday school, or our neighbours' children. Are you loving, respecting, listening to your parents? And if you're encouraging parents, you might not be a parent, but your sister or brother might be. Are you encouraging them, reminding them what are the key elements of being a parent? And are you representing God in that role?
Yeah, that's right. And it's that picture again, isn't it, of generational legacy that you will continue, Lord willing, under his grace to be invested in that. And in doing so, as that relationship is honoured, it goes well.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yep.
Now, so one of the questions that came in again was, what's the biblical perspective on being a father and a mother? What is it that makes the role honourable? Two parts to that one.
Yeah, two parts to it. I think that's right. If we understand what it is to be a father and mother, then why it's honourable will speak for itself. A couple of things we've covered already, Shebu, is the idea of rule and authority. God is the ruler of the world, but he puts man there and says, now you go and rule this world under me.
Yeah.
And then, so there's from that point, there's a reverence to the one who gave you that authority in the first place. He gives to each parent that authority. So there's rule, and there's that instruction, as you said, in the law. Here, I'm giving this law to you, now teach it to your children. There's this instructional nature, just as God instructs Adam, so we're to instruct our children, or as Moses instructed Israel, so Israel is to instruct future generations. So there's rule and teaching, and there's that provision. I think that's the one that we most naturally resonate with, provision. Jesus knows that when he says in the Sermon on the Mount, you guys know how to give good gifts to your children. You know to give them bread. So that's the one that's most natural to us. But that provision includes giving of life from the very start and their daily needs. We do that pretty well, I think, as parents, generally. And neglect really stands out to society. Those three things foster the right response from children of respect and listening and thankfulness. But we have to work on doing those things well.
And I think in that second part, what is that makes a role honourable? I think firstly, this is God's design, you know, between how he's created to be his ideal plan, or I guess the perfect picture is a dad and a mum. And that was God's design. And obviously, as we mentioned in the sermon, that sin has corrupted that, broken it. And we know that so well in our world and culture, in that the reality, this is not the reality for a lot of people, that it's hard to even perhaps consider what it means to honour your father and mother. Maybe you haven't had a dad. Maybe you haven't even had a mum. And so it is challenging, but I think these words are there to remind us this is how God has designed it. And also it's for people who are actually already broken and living in the broken world. So they're also still expected to, particularly as followers of God, to live this out.
There is a lot of brokenness and it can be hard, but if we see that clear design, as you said, we can start to appreciate it. I might read this. This is what Calvin said, and I really like it. It's hard to learn to honour people because we all want to rule our own lives our way. It's very hard. But God has chosen the most amiable and the least invidious way of teaching us. The most amiable, the gentlest way he could, that gradually accustoms us to learn subjection. That is a parent. That from a baby we're growing up and we're being given life, provided for, instructed and governed. All of that seems so natural to us as children. So there are really bad examples, but generally speaking, children learn that from an early age to listen, to respect, and to be thankful.
And I think another reflection has been perhaps you're listening to this and maybe that hasn't been your experience, that whether if it's mum hasn't been around much or dad, or you've grown up in a single parent home. I think this wonderful truth in God's word is a reminder that there is an opportunity under his grace to restart. And even as a single parent, you have the opportunity to put this principle into practice and to train up your son or your daughter. Even as a single parent, it will be hard, but to actually train them up to what does it look like to have them honour you, particularly as you display the loving authority of God in their lives. Then I think as well, this is where the New Testament's helpful, and I think this was God's design anyway, even in the Old Testament, that the community of God's people were meant to be that extra help the extra parents, the extra uncles and aunties, grandparents. And that's the vision that we have. And I think sometimes, maybe not all, but sometimes the danger is to forget that when we see those who are struggling, either as a single parent or to become alongside and be that extra help to serve alongside them, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If we can see what element am I struggling to convey to my children, where can I get outside help for that?
Yep.
And just a reminder too, in a generation where it can be child-led parenting, where it seems like we're being encouraged to just let them find their own way.
Yep.
This is a real challenge to that idea. So that children do need the nurturing and instruction of this is how life is supposed to be lived for flourishing. And that can give great confidence to the single parent and to the mother and father as well, that actually it is right that I seek to rein this in and I don't just have to let my children do whatever they want.
It's good. Well, I think we're sort of heading towards a bit more practical ideas and thoughts. So the other question that came in was, what does it look like to obey your parents in the Lord, as it says in Ephesians? So that's in Ephesians 6:1-4. And how would this affect a relationship between Christians and non-Christians? So I'll read the passage. So this is Ephesians 6, verses 1-4. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. So Paul's quoting the commandment. And he says, this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
Yeah, obey your parents in the Lord. What do you think? We don't know exactly what this person was thinking, but in general, what do you think that people are getting at when they say, what does it mean in the Lord?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think even on the very surface level, in the Lord means firstly we're assuming that person is a follower of Christ, that they are in Christ, they're a follower of Jesus. And I think also it's just as you would obey God, you're desiring to obey your parents. And particularly in the context of that passage, there's a whole design that is there between husband and wife, wife to husband, husband to wife. God's picture of Jesus' love for his church, the bride. And then it goes into the flow of the parents. And then I think that's why Paul sandwiches it with fathers do not provoke, because, that's a great verse, a challenging verse, even as a dad. I think it begins with that. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a little phrase that when you take it on your own, you can start asking these questions. Does it mean my parents who are Christian, but I don't have to obey my parents who are not Christian? Or does it mean that I, as a child, should, in the Lord, obey my parents? In seeking to serve the Lord, obey my parents. And so it is worth wrestling over and thinking about, but I do think the key element is what you spoke about, which is because parents are modelled on the rule and provision and instruction of God, because parents are like little gods, then whenever we obey our parents, we are obeying God and the authority that he has put in place. So if we're seeking to be Christian and live for the Lord, we will obey those he's put in authority. Has wider application all through the New Testament as well about kings and all those who are in authority. But in the most specific, most important case, the one who gave you life, the one who raised you, the one who's instructed you, we should honour them to the degree that it honours God. And it's a nonsense to obey your parents if their instruction is disobey the Lord.
Correct. Yeah, and I think I think as I think more on the question, if you want to kind of not water it down, but if you want to kind of break down what it means to obey, well, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? To display that you love God and love others in the way that you respond to your parents. And so there's multiple ways to do that in honoring your parents. But as you said, right, whether if they're Christians or non-Christians, you're still expected to display honoring.
Yeah.
Because this is what God requires of us. I
Yeah.
think the difference, not difference, I think the great beauty that we have now because of Christ and his work and the gospel, and we have the Holy Spirit who helps us to enable us. What does that look like? But there is moments where if a parent's asking or requiring something that is not according to what God requires, in that moment is when you're first going, no, I need to honor God first.
Yep.
Respect them, might disagree on it, like I used the illustration, didn't go into it on that Sunday, but, someone says to you, you feel or challenged, God's stirring me to be in mission or ministry, and your parents might lovingly, not meaning to discourage you, might say, actually, what are you doing? Got a great career, you're doing great work, why don't you pursue that? On one hand, it's wisdom. On one hand, it's when you need to go, well, what does it look like now to step out? Where you need to seek the counsel of others, seek God's wisdom and his word. And at some point, you might have to say, Mum and Dad, I love you, but this is the direction God is calling me into this.
Yeah. Yeah, those particular tricky cases don't water down at all the general principle. They just take a lot of thought and care. And there's so many variables that need to be discussed. The stage of life that you're in, if you're in year 12, if you just finished year 12, it's a slightly different question to when you're 27 and you want to give up your career in dentistry to go, or use your dentistry to go overseas and stop making money, whatever. So, there's a lot of wisdom there. But maybe that's a chance to, as you said, to get more practical and just say, what can it look like as Spirit-filled Christians who are trying to do more than just the bare minimum to honour our parents?
Yep.
So what would you say are some practical ways of demonstrating that honour?
I think, once again, the thing that with some of these commandments, it's like you got to think through what season of life you're in.
Yep.
If you're I doubt anyone below the age of wherever's listening to this podcast, but if you're a young teenager or a young adult, you're in a season where
I here to bring the younger audience in, or you?
No, I don't think if anyone's listening to this who's young, they probably came across it by mistake and they're really disappointed now. They've been listening to two guys talk about honouring their parents.
Two old dads.
Two old dads, that's right. I think it depends on the season, but what that looks like, I just sometimes wonder, it's actually asking the question and knowing what your parents are like. I think sometimes over the seasons of life, I'm at the moment, for example, at this stage, my kids think I'm pretty cool. I know you won't believe it, Mark, but they do.
Your days are numbered.
Exactly. My days are numbered, right? There'll be a moment where they'll go, oh, my word, Dad, why did you say that? So I think when we get to that age of, I'm not sure, we need to step back and go, hold on. What does it look like to honour my mum and dad? I don't know if I've answered your question. I feel like I'm rambling at the moment.
Look, I think it's interesting that even I break into joking about it because it is such a foreign thing, like honour. It's so old-fashioned. But the fact is, if we model honouring our parents well, then our children will grow up to see that as well.
Yep.
And for me, I think if we think of those three elements of parenthood, which is to rule and to instruct and to provide for, then I can think of in three categories. Am I doing something to show my parents that I am grateful for what they've given me? That can be a yearly reminder on their birthday or something, or on my birthday or on my whatever. Thank you for what you've given me. Am I saying thank you a lot? I think that's important. But they're also there to rule and instruct. So that does change over time. But I can show a great reverence if I say, I'm thinking of making this decision. What do you think? Or what are your opinions on this? Now, I know that's a scary thing. There's a lot of people out there going, oh, no, I never want to ask them. But you show reverence. You're not necessarily as an adult child committed to that path in the same way that you were as a child. But you can demonstrate that reverence and your children will see that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the joys and privileges is walking alongside families as they say goodbye to their loved ones. And often, the eulogy or the reflection from the kids or grandkids is interesting to listen to. And I think the thing, even this past week, we had the joy of saying goodbye to someone who made it to 100, loved Jesus all the way to the end, even to her last breath. And it was such a privilege to hear her kids and grandkids, and I think the great grandkids were there too, just talking about her in a way. And it made me go, actually, these are the kind of things you need to say as well when they're alive.
Yeah.
Not wait for the day that all of a sudden you've got 2 minutes or 3 minutes to share something. So as you said,
how much will it bless them if they hear it?
Yeah. Yep.
I wonder, I was thinking about how much we act like teenagers as adults.
Uh-huh.
So we tell our kids to talk to us and how was your day and tell me all about it. But do we still act the same way to our parents?
Yeah, good.
And we just don't really involve them, don't really include them. And I know it's scary because we'll get into the long conversations, but we can honour them by actually opening up and saying, this is what I'm wrestling with, struggling with. Do you have any advice? And as you said, the grandparent generation, are we involving them? What a scary thing to ask your parents for advice on your kids, or can you talk to my kids?
Yeah.
But if God's economy is right, they will have a wealth of wisdom.
Yep.
And that might even be something that you need to hear.
Yep.
Are you humble enough to honour them and listen for their advice to you and to your children?
And I think that, one of the questions was, how do adult children honour their parents? And we've sort of gone into it already. And Tim Challis, you can Google him. He writes a really helpful blog on various topics. But one of the things he talks about is forgive them, because we've all got things that we've been hurt by our parents. Learn to forgive them because Christ has forgiven you. Speak well of them, particularly in those family chats that we might have that our parents don't know about. Now they do. Speak well of them both. And then, I really appreciated it. Esteem them publicly and privately. And I found that challenging. Obviously, he's coming from an American context where Aussies, we tend to, our esteeming publicly is kind of having a bit of a banter. But what does that actually look like in a God-honoring way? I found that helpful to reflect on. Yeah,
it is. It's challenging to, we just like to put, I was going to say Australians like to put people down. I like to.
Yeah.
It's just a way of humour, but to speak well of my parents and my parents-in-law is a challenge. And then also I think to speak humbly about ourselves as, you know what, we expect you to honour us, but I know we're not perfect. And I hope you don't carry this on to the next generation. That can be a powerful thing to say, and that can actually engender more respect because then they're not thinking that you're so arrogant to think they should copy you in everything.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So one of the questions that came in was about, and this is maybe connected to the way society or our culture thinks about it, is one, how does this affect the wider relationship in the church and society? And what is society lacking in honour, and why does it seem old-fashioned?
Yeah, I think we have talked a little bit about that, haven't we? But remembering that the first children, Adam and Eve, their fundamental problem was, we don't want God to rule over us. We want to rule ourselves, and that carries on. We have a general inherent distrust of authority because we want to be the rulers. So keeping that in mind is really helpful. Another element of it is if a key element of being a parent is the fact that you've given life to something. I don't think we think of the significance of that quite enough, that God allows us to be creators, that by our decision we give life, we choose to give life. All sorts of things happen by accident, but by design it's supposed to be that a man and woman get together and say, let's be committed to each other and let's have children. And just as it says in Genesis 5, that Adam created a son in his likeness. So that's the biblical view of how important and significant it is. And so therefore the one that gives you life should be honoured because it's special. But when we don't think about life as anything but random chance, a chance occurrence, we emphasise the fact that out of 1,000 sperms, one succeeded, and it's all about chance, not the fact that the parents got together and decided under God to make a child. Or we say about, or our children grow up in a world where they look back and think, well, I could have been aborted if it wasn't convenient. I'm not really that special. Then it's very hard to have that honour and to conceive of parents being in a sense, in the place of God, the one who gives life because he loves and wants us to flourish.
That's always a good question, right? Or it comes back to that in doing this, we're ultimately honouring God and displaying what our relationship with God is like. And I look, my reflection has been, there's a lady by the name of Kathleen Nielsen. She's written a book called Making Good Return, and particularly focused on, I haven't read it yet, but reading a lot of reviews for it in preparation for the sermon. And one of the things that she talks about is the reality that we are in most of the generations where our parents are actually going to get older, and we will be around too, most likely, under God. And so that means, do we have a Christian ethic around this? Or are we just letting the culture shape it for us? So I grew up in a culture where, if we were living in India, well, most likely my parents would still be living with me, or I'd be living with them. So there's that kind of cultural aspect too. So when we came to Australia, it was quite interesting. And even for me, I remember as a young person, what's a retirement home? I've never heard of that, and it felt like this sort of idea of putting them away picture. And so I remember talking to Beck, my wife, and having early discussions on, hey, for us in our marriage, what would it mean to care for our parents? What does that actually look like? And I think part of that is it's good to have those discussions now, but involving your parents, particularly if they're getting older, don't just assume this is what they want.
Yeah, that's the cycle, isn't it? Because they become dependent again, and there's God's wisdom there. And so it comes back to that, why will society flourish if we do this? Because if we're honouring our parents, there's a hope that our children will respect us and care for us as well. So it is God's design. I was thinking it'd be remiss to talk about how Jesus fits into this. And the other thing is, and it's almost connected to him as well, but the other element, you talked about forgiveness, forgiving your parents, is to remember, I've talked about three elements. I keep coming back to them, of ruling and teaching and providing, but there is that grace, that in God's essential character is that grace, that he, even though his children rebel against him, yet he shows favour towards them and he calls them back. And we get that prodigal son idea as well in the New Testament of the father who runs out, that even though the son is deserving of death according to the law, because it's such a heinous thing to reject the authority and be disrespectful to your father, that demonstrates how disrespectful it is, but God's grace overwhelms that picture and he runs out. I don't know if you mentioned that, the prodigal son.
No.
But someone mentioned it recently, and it's a good picture to keep in mind for when our fathers failed us, but God is a gracious, loving father, but also for when we are disappointed by our own earthly fathers, or when we're not that good of a parent to our children. That's the model that we're looking for. And when our children hurt us.
Yeah, that's right. And the gospel link, I don't think I've appreciated as much in the past till obviously when we're going through these commandments, asking the question, how does Jesus fulfill this? Or how did he live this out? Whatever that language you might use. And, that wonderful image of a young Jesus in the temple having discussions. Parents are like, where have you been? We've lost you. Comes back and his response is, did you know? No, I must be a part of on my father's business or doing my father, and then he was submissive to the parents. He went down. That's the language that, and I think, it's an interesting thought to think, here is the one who's the Son of God, who is ultimately wanting to do the Father's will, but yet willing to submit to that earthly authority, as in God's design. And he did so perfectly, even
so
to the
perfectly.
very end, which I'm very deeply thankful for.
That's our hope. He did that obedience for us. He did that reverence for us. And the other thing I wanted to point out was how he fills both roles perfectly. So he not only is the perfect obedient son, but he is about his Father's business. And as he says in John, I am the one who has authority from my Father to give life. I do everything my Father does. So in that sense, he's also the perfect Father, right? I'm not saying he's God the Father, but his role is he does all of those things that I've said a father does. He gives life, eternal life, and he teaches and instructs, teach them to obey all things I've commanded you, and he provides, I'll be with you always. So he is, Isaiah 9 says that in that most confusing passage, a son is born, a child, he's the everlasting Father. It's talking about his rule there, and he is the perfect ruler. So he is worthy of all honor and respect. As a parent who provides rules and cares, if you like. Not to confuse the Father and the Son.
No. That's good. Well, in regards to the questions, I think we've covered most of it. Is there anything else that you would add or say or comment before we wrap up?
Oh, I think that I just wanted to bring those points out, so I'm happy that we've done that. I think there's still plenty to reflect on, and I think there's plenty of opportunity for people to come and say, in this individual case, what can we do? Or to talk about it with each other, or to get involved in other people's lives and say, have you thought about how we do this?
Yeah. And I think for those of you who call Canterbury home, and if you're listening to this, I would one of the joys and privileges of serving Canterbury is seeing the broad range of age groups that we have in our church family. So we would encourage you on those Sundays, particularly on Sundays when you're hanging out, if you've got questions about what does it mean to honour, what does it mean to parent your kids, talk to one another, go across the aisle and chat to someone that you wouldn't normally necessarily talk to, and just ask them, hey, what did you do in this situation? Because, just as God spoke to a people, we are his people living in this season of life in our world. And in doing so, we ultimately glorify him.
What if I do leave with this thought on election day in the United States, where it's a fight between the conservatives and the progressives?
You're going there already.
Well, I'm going there, right? So that we hear that it's not two old guys here saying we have to be conservative. This is not about conservatism, and we have to do things the way they were done in the past. And we have to do family meals the way we did it in the past, and we have to do Sundays the way we did it in the past. This is not about conservatism, but nor is it about progressivism, saying we have to leave everything in the past behind and we have to forge onto new and better ways of parenting and living. This is about reformation. This is about revolution. Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, on the whole history of the church, did this so well. He said it's not about preserving this or that, it's about getting back to who Christ was. Paul said it even better. He said we're being transformed in God's image day by day. That's what we're about. If we're being transformed in God's image, we'll honour our parents better, we'll honour God better, and that's the work of the Spirit in us.
That's great. Well, on that note, friends, thanks for joining us today. We're going to wrap up our podcast number 2. There'll be more coming out, Lord willing, in the next few weeks, and please feel free to share. And if you've got any more comments, like Mark said, any questions and so on, please do let us know and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, mate.